Hello, this is Darrell Castle with today's Castle Report. This is Friday, the 4th day of April, the year of our Lord 2025. I will be talking today about efforts to end the war in Ukraine, as well as a recent New York Times article which attempts to explain the war in Ukraine, the war against Russia. I will also talk a little about the apparent military buildup in the Middle East for a coming U.S. attack against Iran and its nuclear research facilities. Last Sunday, March 30th, 2025, the New York Times published an extensive article by investigative reporter Adam Entous entitled, quote, "The Partnership, the Secret History of the War in Ukraine," end quote. Mr. Entous claims to have interviewed many sources in many different countries while working on the report, which he says took over a year to complete. His report provides some answers to the questions of how Ukraine was able to effectively keep Russia at bay and on the defensive for over 3 years. You know my position by now that the Times has become nothing more than a mouthpiece for the Democrat Party, so this article, which started a year before the presidential election, is puzzling. I suppose the idea is that it can't hurt Biden now, so why not publish and reveal what many of us have suspected all along? I certainly suspected it, but I admit I didn't suspect the extent of U.S. involvement alleged by the Times article. Mr. Entous would have had to talk to and probably clear his article through some very high-ranking individuals, and the Russians were certain to see it at that time when negotiations with Putin are at a critical stage. The article then is an admission. It's an admission to Putin of America's vast involvement in and orchestration of the war conducted by the United States directly against nuclear-armed Russia. Quote, "The United States was woven into the killing of Russian soldiers on sovereign Russian soil," end quote. The article alleges that the United States waged and is still waging an undeclared, unauthorized war against Russia. American officers, some deployed inside Ukraine, have been selecting targets for attack and authorizing individual strikes, making these offers, in essence, combatants. The article presents a picture of the war in which the American military entered into an informal partnership with the Ukrainian government, and the U.S. planned everything Ukraine did. Everything from large-scale troop movements to every long-range strike were planned by American officers who even directed Ukraine's counteroffensives. The Americans decided what Russian troops and civilian targets to attack. They transmitted targeting data and launch codes to the Ukrainians for the weapons provided by the taxpayers of the United States. The intelligence gathering system was vast, including satellite surveillance as well as people on the ground. It allowed for everything from big picture battle strategy down to precise targeting information for individual soldiers in the field. The U.S. Command Center in Wiesbaden, Germany, oversaw the whole thing and reviewed each long-range HIMARS missile strike against Russians and advised Ukrainians of how to position their launchers and how to most effectively time the strikes. One European intelligence officer quoted in the article said that the U.S. was so closely involved it was effectively part of the, quote, kill chain. The American effort was known as Task Force Dragon and was far more detailed and involved than I have time to review in this report. The last thing I will say is that the U.S. provided information that allowed for the sinking of the Moskva, the flagship of the Russian Black Sea Fleet, also the missile attack against Kerch Bridge, which runs from the Russian mainland to Crimea. Well, folks, this information and a lot more that I have mentioned, including drone and missile attacks inside Russia, were documented in the article, but now the Russians also have this admission right at the time of peace negotiations. Why? Why is the question, and I think the answer is to admit to Putin what the U.S. involvement is, to give him the opportunity to end the war on his terms, not U.S. terms. Excuse me, folks. Every time the U.S. negotiators stake out a position of agreeing to Russian demands, Zelensky says no. I want everything returned to 2014 positions. The Americans tell him that is not going to happen. It cannot be our position. So I think he is out of the picture now. Zelensky, that is, out of the picture, and the negotiations are between Trump and Putin. One last very interesting thing about the article is that it is a direct contradiction of the New York Times information provided to the American people for over 3 years. The Times systematically lied to America, deliberately parroted Biden's denials of American involvement in the war for 3 years. According to journalist Bob Woodward from his book, quote, War, about the Biden administration, Biden had to constantly reassure the American people they would not be dragged into a war with Russia. The problem, Mr. Woodward, is that they were not dragged in. They entered the war voluntarily and enthusiastically. Having said all that, is my conclusion that the article is most likely a CIA plant, but that doesn't mean every word of it is not true. The entry into the war on Ukrainian soil by America reminds one of the famous quote by Henry Kissinger, quote, "It is dangerous to be an enemy of America, but it is fatal to be a friend of America," end quote. So Trump and his negotiating team are working feverishly to bring the war to a conclusion as he promised he would. It is clear now that the terms will be Russian, not American, and certainly not Ukrainian. The Europeans, especially Starmer in the UK, talk about staying in the war, even committing their own troops, but that is an obvious bluff. Trump asked Mr. Starmer directly in public when he talked about committing British troops, "So you think you can defeat Russia by yourself?" That's a pretty revealing statement of the American position on Ukraine. However, the American position on Iran is completely different. Part of the Trump-Putin 90-minute phone call back in February was apparently to discuss the idea that if the United States attacked Iran, Russia would stay out of the struggle. The massive military buildup of United States strategic forces in the Middle East seems headed toward a strike against Iran. We are constantly told that Iran can't be allowed to have nuclear weapons, but given the attitudes of China and Russia toward their ally, Iran, I would not be surprised if Iran already had nuclear weapons. The Iranians apparently believe that buying nukes from a legitimate power does not make you legitimate, but being able to make your own nuclear weapons does. The U.S. has reportedly deployed 6 or 7 of its B-2 stealth bombers to Diego Garcia, a joint U.S.-British island airstrip in the Indian Ocean. The island lies about 2,400 miles due south of Iran, along with the B-2s. Their refueling tankers have also been included in the roughly 5,000-mile round-trip journey to Iran. A question occurs to me: why can't Israel fight its own wars? Why can't Israel fight its own war against Iran if he thinks war is necessary? The answer we are given is that Israel has no heavy bombers. The only non-nuclear bomb that could penetrate Iran's hardened nuclear research facilities is a U.S.-made 30,000-pound bomb designed to penetrate deep into the ground and explode, opening the way for less powerful munitions. The explanation may not be accurate, but it's the one given when that question is asked. Air and Space Forces magazine has revealed that the U.S. is deploying many assets besides the B-2. By the way, folks, the U.S. only built 21 B-2s. 21 of the 150 approximately that were planned. It is a very expensive airplane. 2 of them have already been lost in accidents, so 19 are left. About 7 of those are currently in the middle of the Indian Ocean, 2,000 miles from anywhere. The other deployed assets include A-10 ground attack aircraft from the Idaho National Guard, along with the personnel necessary to operate these aircraft effectively. Trump has repeatedly threatened the Iranians, telling them that they have 2 months to dismantle their nuclear facilities and permit inspection, or, quote, something very bad will happen to them, end quote. A great deal of confidence is placed in the claim that Israel destroyed Iran's anti-air defense batteries, including the advanced S-300 and S-400 missile batteries provided by Russia. In response to Trump's threat The Iranians threatened a preemptive attack on the American base at Diego Garcia, along with other U.S. assets in the area. That doesn't worry me that much because I doubt the Iranians are that stupid. The U.S. currently has about 10 minor bases or outposts in the Middle East, manned by about 50,000 troops, counting those at sea, with the Navy. Rather than a preemptive strike, Iran has appealed to the UN to intervene in light of Trump's threat to them. The Iranians reportedly have massed over 1,000 long-range missiles to attack U.S. and Israeli positions. They say they will target Israeli nuclear sites first. The range of those missiles puts U.S. bases and naval forces in the Gulf and the Med well within range. I have said many times that anti-air defenses can handle a few missiles, as they have done repeatedly in response to Houthi attacks in the Red Sea. But a swarming attack by hundreds or thousands of missiles, some of them hypersonic, are unstoppable. That all means a great many casualties on both sides, along with a great deal of infrastructure destruction and possible radioactive contamination. Large numbers of American casualties are about the only thing that will force the apparently lethargic American people to look at this problem. In conclusion, folks, last Tuesday, last Tuesday, Benjamin Netanyahu announced the lifting of all tariffs Israel imposes on American goods. Did you know Israel placed tariffs on American goods? Because I didn't. That makes our previous welfare to the nation of Israel even more egregious. America doesn't seem to gain much from unconditionally backing nuclear-armed Israel in whatever it wants to do. Why would this nation let Israel tax American companies while lavishing such aid on them? Tucker Carlson asks us a very legitimate question. Do D.C. politicians think bending over backward to please the Israeli government is somehow America's moral duty? Why? Here's a quote from Tucker. As Donald Trump's special envoy for hostage affairs said last month, the U.S. government is not an agent of Israel. The removal of these tariffs should remind our leaders of that. Otherwise, Washington's decades-long humiliation exercise of forcing Americans to kiss the ground the foreign country walks on will continue to drag on. Eventually, it will be too much for the people to handle, end quote. Finally, folks, is this coming war against Iran America first? I think not. Would America stand by while so many civilians were killed by any other nation than Israel? Again, I think not. At least that's the way I see it. Till next time, folks, this is Darrell Castle. Thanks for listening.